cruel CEO's mom mocked his poor ex, but DNA results from her twin boys shook the entire family. Warm welcome, my beautiful souls, to Beyond Color Stories. I'm your storyteller, James, and I hope you're doing all right today, wherever you are in the world. Before we begin this emotional journey together, tell me, where are you listening from? Drop your city, your country in the comments. And one more thing, how's the weather in your town? Is the sky smiling, or are the clouds hugging the earth with a little rain? While you're here, my dear friend, I want to ask you something from the heart. If my stories have touched even a small part of your soul, please join James's family by hitting that subscribe button. I pour my heart into every word, and your support keeps these stories alive. When you subscribe, you don't just become a viewer, you become family. May peace enter your home today, may your heart stay light, and may love find you in the quiet moments. Now, hold your breath, open your heart. Let's dive into the story. Star. Elara's fingers trembled as she stood on the grand stone steps of the Blackwell Mansion, a place that once echoed with laughter and fleeting dreams of love, but now radiated only rejection and cold shadows. Her eyes, once filled with hope, were now clouded with tears that refused to fall. They clung to her lashes, held back by sheer pride. The soft breeze of the late evening brushed against her face, but there was no comfort in it, only a chilling reminder that she no longer belonged here. Behind her, the golden doors of the estate slammed shut with finality, like a cruel full stop at the end of a sentence that had begun in love but ended in disgrace. Leonard's mother, Veronica Blackwell, had made her decision clear and brutal, leaving no space for dignity or explanation. Her words echoed like thunder through Elara's mind, sharp and unforgiving. "You're a filthy, gold-digging street rat, and you'll never be part of this family, not now, not ever. My son may be blind with lust, but I'm not letting trash like you pollute our legacy." Every syllable had been a slap, every glare a dagger, and though Elara had long prepared herself for Veronica's disapproval, nothing could have softened the cruelty with which the verdict was delivered. What pierced her deeper than Veronica's venom, though, was Leonard's silence. He had stood there, tall and emotionless, as if carved from ice, his sharp jaw clenched but his eyes empty. Not once had he raised his voice in defense, not once had he stepped forward to say, "She's with me." Instead, his silence wrapped around her like a noose, tightening with every second until she felt her soul suffocating. Elara had turned to him just once, silently pleading with her gaze, her eyes screaming the words her voice could no longer form. "Please, say something." But Leonard had only looked away, jaw tight, lips sealed, refusing to challenge his mother's wrath. That moment shattered something inside her, something that had once believed love could conquer pride, that emotion could break through legacy, that two people could build something pure even in the coldest of castles. She realized then that love, if it had ever truly existed between them, meant nothing without the courage to protect it. With her head held high but her heart breaking into pieces, Elara turned and walked away from the man she loved and the house that had stolen her dreams. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she passed the grand foyer, but each step felt like a war against gravity. Outside, the moonlight bathed the driveway in silver, and the chauffeur, who once greeted her with respect, now looked through her like she was invisible. No one stopped her. No one asked if she was okay. She reached the main gates with a torn suitcase in one hand and a hollow ache in her chest, every breath harder than the last. She didn't have a destination in mind, just a desperate need to escape, to run far from the shame, the judgment, and the man who chose silence over love. She had nothing but the clothes on her back, a few crumpled bills in her purse, and a secret that weighed more than her soul. She was pregnant, carrying the child of a man who had watched her be destroyed without blinking. She didn't cry. Not then. Her tears were locked away, guarded by the last shred of pride she refused to let die. She walked for hours, the city lights blurring around her steps heavy with exhaustion and pain. Her phone buzzed only once, her best friend Marcia checking in. But she couldn't bear to speak. What would she even say? That she had fallen for a man who had let her be kicked out like a stray dog? That she was now homeless, jobless, and carrying a baby he'd never even know about? Elara collapsed on a park bench just before dawn, the cold metal pressing through her coat, her arms wrapped tightly around her stomach. Instinctively, protectively, the silence of the early morning wrapped around her like a lonely blanket, broken only by the rustle of trees and the occasional car passing in the distance. She stared up at the sky, dark and endless, wondering how something so vast could hold so much pain inside it. And then finally the tears came, silent and slow, tracking down her cheeks like whispers of every broken promise. She wasn't crying for Leonard. Not anymore. She was crying for herself, for the girl who had dreamed too big, trusted too much, loved too deeply, and for the tiny heartbeat now pulsing inside her, unaware of the cruelty of the world it would enter. Elara knew then that she couldn't afford to be weak. She couldn't let her child grow up believing it was unwanted or abandoned. She had to become stronger than she'd ever been. Stronger than Veronica's words, stronger than Leonard's silence, stronger than the loneliness that threatened to swallow her whole. That night, as the first light of dawn peeked over the horizon, she made a vow to herself and to the child growing within her. "You will be loved," she whispered into the wind, her hand resting gently on her belly. "You will never feel the shame they placed on me. You will be everything they said I could never have." The days that followed were the hardest of her life. Elara moved into a tiny room above an elderly widow's garage, paying rent through odd jobs and cleaning work. The smell of bleach became her new perfume, and worn-out sneakers replaced her designer heels. She walked for hours every day, scrubbing floors, babysitting, helping in kitchens, anything that would help her afford vitamins, doctor visits, and baby clothes. Her body ached constantly, and exhaustion clung to her like a second skin. But through it all, she never complained. She didn't allow herself the luxury of grief. Every time her belly grew, so did her resolve. Every time she saw her reflection in a cracked mirror, she reminded herself, "You're not broken. You're building." Her love for her unborn child became the fire that burned away every trace of self-pity. She kept journals, writing letters to her baby, letters filled with love, hope, and whispered promises. "One day you'll read this and know Mama fought for you when no one else would." At night, when the world went quiet, Elara would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking of Leonard, not with longing, but with mourning. He would never know the first kick. He'd never see the tiny socks she folded, or the first ultrasound she cried over alone. She would sometimes wonder what his reaction would have been if he'd known. Would he have still stood silent? Or would he have become the man she believed he was once? But then she would close her eyes and remember the coldness in his gaze as Veronica spat those venomous words. That was her answer. Love didn't matter to people like them. It was currency, not connection. And Elara was done bankrupting herself for people who only measured worth in wealth. She wasn't raising her child in shame. She would raise them in pride, in dignity, and in love. Months passed, and her bump grew round and beautiful. The local baker gave her free bread when he noticed her struggle. The kind librarian gave her children's books in secret. A quiet community of strangers became her unexpected village. They never asked about the father. They never judged. And Elara, slowly but surely, began to smile again. Not the smile of a girl in love, but of a woman finding her strength. She spent evenings sewing tiny clothes, humming lullabies to her unborn baby, imagining their laugh, their eyes, their future. There was no mansion, no butlers, no gold-lined dreams, just warm blankets, gentle love, and the belief that happiness wasn't about where you came from, but what you built from the ashes. One cold evening, as rain tapped gently against the window, Elara lit a candle and sat at the edge of her bed. She opened her journal and wrote one final letter. Dear baby, tonight I choose to let go of the past. I choose us. I choose love, not because they gave it to me, but because I will give it to you. The world tried to break me before you came, but you rebuilt me from the inside. I don't know what the future holds, but I know this: you will never walk alone. You are not a mistake. You are my miracle. And as she blew out the candle, her heart, though still scarred, beat steady and strong. Elara had been discarded like nothing, but in losing everything, she had found the one thing that truly mattered: purpose. Not born of luxury or names, but of the fiercest, most unconditional love a human heart could hold. And as the night deepened around her, Elara placed her hand on her belly and smiled softly. The world may have tried to end her story, but it had only just begun. The night passed gently, and as the first beams of golden sunlight began to peer through the tattered curtains of the small room Elara called home, her breath grew shallow, her fingers clenched tightly into the worn sheets beneath her, and pain rippled through her like waves crashing against a fragile shore. Her back arched instinctively, and tears sprung to her eyes, but not from sorrow. This pain was different, deeper, more primal. It was time. Her baby was coming. Alone, trembling, and gasping through clenched teeth, she reached for the old phone beside her and called the small countryside clinic 2 miles down the road. Her voice, though strained, carried the urgency of life's next chapter, and within minutes the old nurse who had seen her for monthly checkups was at her door, wrapping a comforting arm around her as they helped her into a rusted pickup truck. The drive was slow, winding through the misty early morning fields, each bump on the unpaved road causing Elara to wince, her body tense, her heart pounding. Not with fear for herself, but with overwhelming love and worry for the life she was about to bring into this world. She had imagined this moment many times, what it would be like to see her baby, to hold them, to whisper her love into their ears. But never once had she imagined doing it alone, with no family to cheer her on, no hand to hold, no name to call for comfort. Yet even as the pain threatened to crush her, there was a strange calm in her spirit, a stillness carved from months of silent strength and quiet sacrifice. By the time she was wheeled into the small delivery room, her body drenched in sweat, the nurse whispered softly, "You're strong, Elara. You've come this far. You can do this." And in that moment, something inside her answered back, not with words, but with raw, unshakable will. Hours passed. Her cries echoed off the faded walls, her fingers dug into the mattress, and as the sun climbed higher into the sky, her screams gave way to something far more powerful, a baby's cry. Then another. Two cries. Elara blinked through tears, her breath caught in her throat. Twins, the doctor said in awe, wrapping two tiny bundles in warm cloth and placing them gently against her chest. The world stopped spinning. Time seemed to freeze as she looked down at their perfect faces, two boys, identical in beauty, yet each already shining with his own soul. Max, the firstborn, opened his eyes first, dark and deep, curious and bold. Milo, quieter, nestled closer to her warmth, his small fingers curling into the fabric of her gown. Elara broke down, sobbing harder than she had ever sobbed before, not in pain, but in overwhelming love, in awe of the miracle that had just unfolded in her arms. "You're everything I've ever wanted," she whispered between tears, kissing their foreheads with lips that trembled, not from fear, but from gratitude. "Every kick she had felt, every lonely night she had endured, every insult she had swallowed, every floor she had scrubbed, every moment she had nearly given up. It had all been worth it for this. As she cradled them close, her fingers traced the tiny dimples on their cheeks, the same ones that had once made her heart flutter on Leonard's face. Max's eyes were wide, filled with curiosity, and a spark too bright to belong to a newborn, and Milo's little pout reminded her of the rare moments Leonard had let down his guard. For a moment she was pulled back into the past, the hallway where Leonard had kissed her for the first time, the way he used to laugh when she teased him, the nights they whispered dreams into each other's skin. But those memories were ghosts now, echoes that had no place in this sacred, silent room. She shut them out, gently but firmly, just as she had shut the door on his name the day she walked away. Her sons were not mistakes or regrets. They were the purpose fate had always meant for her. She didn't need Leonard's presence to validate them, and she refused to let his abandonment poison the love they deserved. The doctor asked for names, and without hesitation she smiled and said, "Max and Milo, my brave boys." No last name. No mention of the man who had given them life but not love. Just her and them, a new family born in silence but full of the loudest kind of love. The next few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights, soft lullabies, and learning how to survive all over again. The room above the garage became their haven, a place where warm bottles, the scent of baby powder, and the gentle hum of lullabies filled the air. Elara barely slept. Every time one of the twins cried, she was there, lifting them with aching arms and humming until they drifted back into dreams. She learned how to rock two babies at once, how to feed one while soothing the other, how to change diapers in the dark, and how to mask her exhaustion with a smile. She stitched baby clothes out of old fabric scraps, knitted tiny booties with borrowed yarn, and built mobiles out of twine and paper stars. She made magic out of nothing. Some days she didn't eat so she could buy milk. Other days she walked miles just to pick up hand-me-downs from a charity shop. And yet, through it all, she never complained, not once. She held her babies and whispered, "We're okay, my loves. We're going to be okay." And they were, because love, fierce and unwavering, filled every corner of that small space. As Max and Milo grew, so did their questions. They began to notice the things other kids had, fathers who picked them up from school, who played ball in the yard, who came to parent meetings. One afternoon, as Elara walked them home from the park, Max looked up at her with eyes too wise for his age and asked, "Mom, why don't we have a dad like the other boys?" The question hit her like a punch, but she didn't let it show. She crouched down to their level, kissed their foreheads, and said softly, "Because sometimes the best families are made with just love and courage." Milo nodded, too young to understand the depth of her words, but old enough to feel her truth. She didn't lie to them. She didn't say he was dead or that he'd be back someday. She just gave them more love, so much love that they would never feel the emptiness that their father's absence could have carved. Every time they asked again, she gave the same answer, and with every repetition her heart grew stronger, her voice more steady. Her silence became her shield, protecting them from the story they were too young to understand, a story of betrayal, abandonment, and cruel indifference. Elara took on 2 jobs, cleaning houses in the morning, waitressing in the evenings, just to keep the lights on and food on the table. Her body was constantly sore, her hands blistered, her feet swollen. But every night she returned to Max and Milo with a smile on her face and stories on her lips. She turned every hardship into an adventure, every struggle into a lesson of strength. She taught them kindness by giving to others even when she had little. She taught them bravery by facing the world alone and unafraid. She taught them that dignity didn't come from titles or wealth. It came from how you treated people when you had nothing to offer but love. And slowly her boys grew into mirrors of her heart, kind, joyful, compassionate. Max, bold and curious, loved to read and build things out of scrap wood. Milo, quiet and gentle, adored music and would often sing to her as she washed dishes. They filled the house with laughter, with tiny footsteps and wild imaginations, with dreams painted on walls and stories written in chalk on the pavement. The pain of being forgotten never truly faded, but Ilara no longer let it define her. Instead, she poured every ounce of that pain into building a home where love lived in abundance. She didn't measure her worth by the life she left behind, but by the lives she was raising in front of her. There were nights she would lie awake, listening to their even breathing, watching their chests rise and fall with sleep, and wonder what they would become. Would they ever want to meet him? Would they one day ask for more than her love could answer? And on those nights she would press a kiss to each of their foreheads and say, "No matter where you go or what you learn, always remember this. Your mother loved you with everything she had." Because that was her truth. Her motherhood wasn't built on ease or luxury, but on sacrifice, grit, and devotion so deep it could weather any storm. As the seasons changed and birthdays passed, the quiet little house above the garage became more than just shelter. It became a sanctuary. Ilara framed their drawings, pasted glow-in-the-dark stars. On the ceiling, baked misshapen cakes every year, and sang them to sleep with lullabies of her own making. They didn't notice the peeling paint on the walls or the second-hand clothes they wore. All they knew was warmth, laughter, and the soft scent of their mother's hair as she tucked them in at night. And Ilara, in her quiet strength, knew this truth. She had lost a man who never really saw her worth, but in return she had been given two souls who saw her as their entire world. Her journey hadn't been easy, and the scars still ached on rainy nights. But she no longer carried them as wounds. She wore them as armor, because through the silence of her struggle, she had discovered the loudest, most beautiful truth of all. She was enough. It was a rainy Thursday morning when Max awoke with a strange flush in his cheeks, his breathing uneven, and his small body trembling beneath the thin blanket that usually brought him comfort. Ilara had barely taken 2 sips of her tea before Milo came running from the shared bedroom, eyes wide with worry, saying softly, "Mommy, Max feels hot, really hot." Panic struck her heart like a thunderbolt. She rushed to the bed and pressed her palm to Max's forehead. It was burning. His eyelids fluttered, his skin damp with sweat, and he winced when she gently lifted his arm to check for more symptoms. His body ached, he could barely sit up, and he was murmuring incoherent words between short, shuddering breaths. Without a second thought, Ilara wrapped him in the warmest coat she could find, pulled on a hoodie over her own head, and scooped him into her arms. "Milo, baby, stay close to Mommy. Hold my bag tight and don't let go," she instructed, her voice firm despite the chaos building in her chest. The rain outside came down hard, turning the path into slippery puddles, but she didn't care. She had no car, no umbrella, just the determination of a mother whose child was in danger. Her boots splashed through the water as she made her way down to the nearest bus stop, holding Max tightly as he whimpered in pain against her chest. Milo kept up, holding her purse with both hands like she asked, his eyes wide and frightened, but trusting his mother with every step. The city hospital was a towering gray building nestled among taller ones, its emergency wing already busy with noise, people, and urgency. As Ilara rushed through the sliding glass doors, her mind raced with worry. Max had never been this sick before. She approached the triage desk, her voice tight with desperation as she explained her son's symptoms. The nurse asked her to wait while they prepared a room, and Ilara nodded numbly, finding an empty seat in the crowded waiting area. Max was wrapped in her arms like a fragile bird, his breathing shallow. She rocked him gently, whispering comforts through clenched teeth, as her eyes scanned the room for a doctor. Milo sat beside her, unusually quiet, chewing on his lower lip, still clutching the now wet bag in his lap. She brushed his hair back from his forehead and gave him a reassuring smile, even though her insides were collapsing. Minutes dragged on, each one stretched painfully long, the hum of murmuring voices and beeping machines a cruel reminder of how alone she was in this moment. And then, without warning, the air shifted. Ilara felt it before she saw it, a strange stillness, a tightening in her chest as if the past itself had entered the room. She turned her head instinctively, and her breath caught mid-inhale. Walking casually down the hallway, clipboard in hand, was a man she once thought she'd never see again. Leonard Blackwell. Older now, more defined, his tailored suit clinging to broad shoulders with effortless power. His beard was neatly trimmed, his hair darker and swept back, and his presence, even after all these years, still drew every eye in the room. But it wasn't the weight of his money or the confidence in his stride that hit Ilara. It was the coldness in his eyes, the unfamiliar distance in the face she used to know so intimately. Her body froze. She instinctively turned Max's head away and reached for Milo, but it was too late. Milo had already noticed the man across the room and, with the innocent curiosity only a child could carry, stepped away from the bench and began walking toward him. "Milo, come back," she whispered sharply, but the child was too fast. His tiny sneakers squeaked against the floor as he trotted forward, and in a blink, he collided softly into Leonard's legs. Leonard looked down, startled, automatically steadying the little boy by his shoulders. "Hey there, buddy," his voice faltered. His hands froze on Milo's shoulders. His eyes widened. There it was, that unmistakable face, that dimple, that gaze that mirrored his own when he was 5. Confusion clouded his features as he knelt down, face to face with the small boy who stood before him like a living ghost. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Milo," the child replied innocently, his head tilted. "Are you a doctor?" Ilara's entire body shook. She rose slowly, gathering Max tighter in her arms, her eyes never leaving the scene, every nerve inside her flaring with danger. "Milo," she said again, more firmly this time, her voice low and shaking. Leonard looked up, and their eyes locked. For the first time in years, Ilara saw the man who had once held her heart and shattered it without a word. She saw confusion, recognition, and something else, something unsettled, flash across his face. Her pulse roared in her ears. "Ilara?" Leonard said her name like a question, like a name from a dream. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her voice was caught behind a tidal wave of emotion she had buried for years. "Ilara, is that you?" he asked again, his voice lower, now stepping forward slowly as if afraid she'd vanish if he blinked. Milo looked between them, sensing something deeper he couldn't understand. Ilara took a step back. "Don't," she said firmly, her voice hushed but sharp. She turned around, her back now to him, holding Max against her chest while reaching blindly for Milo's hand. She didn't want this. Not here. Not like this. She had built her life away from that man, from that family, from everything they had made her feel. And now the past was standing in a hospital lobby, dressed in expensive silk and smelling like forgotten love. "Wait," Leonard's voice cracked the air again, closer this time. "Ilara, please, talk to me. What is this?" But she didn't respond. She didn't owe him explanations. Not today. Not ever. She walked quickly toward the nurse who was finally calling Max's name. "Room 4, the nurse said kindly. Ilara didn't look back. She just walked faster, her boys by her side. Inside the small pediatric room, Ilara laid Max down carefully on the exam table. A gentle nurse checked his temperature and vitals while Milo sat in the corner, quietly coloring a waiting room page. But Ilara couldn't focus. Her heart was pounding. Her hands were shaking as she tucked the blanket around Max. Her breath was ragged, and she felt the tremor of old wounds ripping open in places she thought had long since healed. Seeing Leonard had undone something. It brought back the sound of that slammed door, the humiliation in Veronica's laughter, the crushing silence from the one man she had begged, silently, to stand up for her. And now he was here, staring at her child with eyes that couldn't lie. What would she say if he demanded answers? What would she do if he saw the truth written in Max and Milo's faces? She had raised them alone. She had bled for them, starved for them, sacrificed every dream for their comfort. Leonard didn't get to walk back into their lives like it hadn't been years of silence. Her hands clenched as she stood near Max, whispering gently to her feverish son, pretending everything was fine. Minutes passed, maybe more. She lost track of time. But then came a knock at the door, a soft, cautious knock that made her stomach twist. She didn't turn. "Come in," the nurse said automatically. The door creaked open. She knew that scent, that presence. Leonard stepped inside slowly, eyes locking on her immediately. He looked at Max, then Milo, then back at her. "You have twins?" he said hoarsely. Ilara's jaw tightened. She didn't answer. "Are they?" He couldn't finish. She turned to face him, standing tall, a mother lion protecting her cubs. "You don't get to ask," she said coldly. "Not here. Not today." His lips parted to speak, but she held up her hand. "Just leave. Please." For a long moment he didn't move. Then he gave a small, reluctant nod. "All right. But this isn't over," he whispered, stepping back into the hallway, the door closing slowly behind him. Ilara leaned back against the wall, her chest heaving with the weight of everything she had carried for years. The storm she had escaped had returned, and it had seen their faces. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew her silence had just shattered. The early morning air inside the hospital lobby was dry, sharp with antiseptic and tension, yet eerily still compared to the storm that had swelled the day before. Ilara stood quietly near the hospital billing counter, her fingers clenched around a folded medical file, her knuckles pale, her eyes scanning every digit on the payment slip as if staring harder would reduce the number. Max had finally rested a little after a sleepless night of fever and tests, and Milo was curled up in the corner seat beside her bag, fiddling with the zipper quietly, his face calm but tired. The nurse had told her she could wait to pay, but Ilara refused. Pride ran thick in her bones, and though her bank account was nearly dry, she wouldn't let anyone say her sons were charity cases. She had already slipped out the food money for the week, trading groceries for a small stack of rupees just to cover today's installment. Her heart ached, but her jaw stayed firm as she reached into her old brown purse and carefully placed the notes on the counter, one after the other, eyes darting down every time the total blinked. Her clothes were clean but faded from endless washing, and the once vibrant scarf she wore around her hair was now pale with age, but she wore them with grace, unaware that the eyes of judgment were once again falling upon her with the same venom as years ago. She heard the click of expensive heels long before the voice followed, sharp, rhythmic, and too familiar to mistake. Veronica Blackwell, pristine as always, with a tailored cream coat slung around her slim shoulders and gold accessories catching the hospital lights like a crown of disdain, strutted across the tiled floor like she owned not only the hospital, but the air itself. Her hair was swept back in a polished bun, her lipstick bold, her diamond earrings swinging with every step as if to remind the world of her worth. And then she saw Ilara. She stopped mid-stride, blinking once, then twice, as if the presence of the woman she had so viciously discarded should have been impossible to witness again, let alone in this city. Her lip curled before the venom escaped. "Well, well," she drawled, the venom in her voice so smooth it almost sounded sweet. "Still playing house with dreams too big for your class, I see." Ilara's back straightened. She didn't turn. She counted her change. Veronica stepped closer, eyes grazing the worn fabric of Ilara's coat, the tired shoes, the thinning scarf. Did you come back to haunt us, or are you just hoping Leonard tosses you a few scraps now that he's got nothing better to do than chase old mistakes? The cruelty was effortless, the words laced with the same disdain she once spat outside the mansion gates years ago, but sharper now, polished with years of unrepentant pride. Ilara inhaled slowly, willing herself not to react. The woman standing before her had taken everything once, her dignity, her love, her hope, but she would not take her peace today. She reached for the receipt with steady hands, nodded to the billing nurse with quiet grace, then turned to gather Milo's hand as he stood beside her silently. But Veronica wasn't finished. Her eyes fell on Milo, on the dimpled cheek, the familiar brows, the shape of the jawline so unmistakably Blackwell it hurt to deny. Her smile widened cruelly. "Are those—" she began, voice mockingly curious. "Oh, darling, you've really outdone yourself, dragging bastards into hospitals now, begging for pennies. You always did aim too high for someone born in dirt." The laughter that followed was piercing, thin, elegant, and brutal. It echoed off the marble walls like glass shattering, drawing a few sideways glances from bystanders, though no one dared intervene. Ilara blinked hard, her throat tight but her face blank. Her eyes didn't water out of weakness. They shimmered with restrained fury, with every insult she had swallowed and refused to return. Her lips trembled only once before she bit them still, then slowly knelt beside her son. Milo looked confused, his small face tilted upward as he watched Veronica's smirking silhouette. "Mommy," he whispered, "why is that lady so mean?" His innocent voice broke something inside Ilara. Not because he asked the question, but because she couldn't give him the answer he deserved. She cupped his cheek softly, her smile warm despite the sting in her heart, and whispered, "Some people forget how to be kind, baby. That's all." Veronica scoffed behind her, the sound as cold as winter steel. "Raising them on riddles now, too. You really are a storybook peasant," she sneered, her arms crossing tightly as she watched the scene unfold. Ilara rose slowly, her hand never leaving Milo's, and looked Veronica square in the eye for the first time since that day she was thrown out like garbage. "Your wealth could never buy the dignity my sons already carry in their blood," she said quietly, her voice clear and controlled. "And nothing you say will ever change that." She didn't wait for a reply. She turned, collected her things, and began walking toward the elevator. Max was waiting upstairs. Her child needed her, and she had no room in her life for ghosts that fed on cruelty. But even as her heels clicked softly away from that bitter laugh, Ilara felt the burn of tears she refused to let fall. Not here. Not now. Not for that woman. She held Milo's hand tighter and walked faster, her spine straight, her breath unsteady but her steps certain. Veronica watched her disappear down the hallway, her smirk fading only slightly, her mind already twisting the implications of what she had seen. The resemblance, the timing, the silence. Her pride wouldn't let her admit the truth, even if it screamed in her face, but suspicion was a seed now planted. Ilara knew it. She could feel it in the weight of the glare on her back. But she wouldn't stop. She wouldn't run. Not anymore. She was no longer the girl begging for approval. She was a mother shielding her sons from fire, and no flame, no matter how rich, would burn them while she breathed. The silence in their small apartment that evening felt heavier than usual. Not the peaceful kind that followed a long day, but a thoughtful, lingering hush that wrapped itself around the walls like fog refusing to lift. After returning from the hospital and checking Max one more time to ensure his fever hadn't returned, Ilara quietly prepared a light dinner, but the boys barely touched their food. Milo played absently with the spoon, dragging it in slow circles across the bowl, while Max sat unusually quiet, his chin resting on his hand, his thoughts clearly drifting far beyond the table. The television murmured softly in the background, but it couldn't reach the tension quietly brewing in the room. Elara sensed it. Mothers always do. She watched her sons, both of whom were always bursting with energy and questions and stories, now lost in silence. Her heart tugged, but she didn't push. She knew, somehow, that something was coming. She just didn't expect it to come with such soft weight, with such truth. After dinner, while Milo quietly dozed off near his coloring books, Max walked over and gently climbed into her lap, without a word, curling into her warmth like he had done as a baby. Elara wrapped her arms around him instinctively, brushing a gentle hand through his curls, her lips resting against his temple as he nuzzled deeper into her chest. She felt him inhale, like gathering courage in his little lungs. Then he said it, softly, simply, but with a truth that pierced deeper than any blade. "Mom, I think he's our dad." Elara froze. Her hands stilled in his hair. Her breath caught just for a second. The sentence was so tender, so free of anger or confusion, and yet it cracked something open inside her that she had boarded up long ago. She didn't speak right away. She didn't know how. "Why do you think that?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper, her heart thudding so hard she feared he might hear it. Max shifted slightly in her lap, then looked up at her with those familiar eyes that didn't just reflect her. They carried the shape of a man she had once trusted with everything. "Because," Max said slowly, "we look like him. Our face, our nose. And when I saw him, my heart felt weird, not scared, not happy, just weird, like I already knew him somehow." He blinked, not quite sure how to put his childlike wisdom into words, but his honesty glowed between them, undeniable and pure. Elara swallowed hard. Her fingers trembled where they rested on his small back. She was about to answer when Milo, half awake from his spot on the floor, added quietly, "He looked at us like he knew us, too." Elara's eyes brimmed, but she held the tears back. She had always known this moment would come, but not like this, not in whispers under dim lights with their dinner plates still on the counter and the city breathing quietly outside the window. She had buried the truth so deeply, not out of shame, but to protect them, to shield their innocent hearts from the cold reality of abandonment. She had never wanted them to carry the weight of rejection that she had once carried like a second skin, but they had felt it anyway, not through words but through instincts, through those deep intuitive cords that bind children to their parents, even when those parents are absent. And it shattered her heart because they weren't angry, they weren't hurt, they weren't demanding anything. They just wanted to understand. They weren't ashamed of who they were or where they came from. They didn't ask why he wasn't around or what he had done. They just asked if the feeling they had, the quiet pull in their hearts, was real, if it meant something. And Elara, who had faced cruel insults, long nights, and an unending storm of loneliness without crumbling, now felt like a fragile leaf trembling in the wind. She kissed Max's forehead, pulled Milo closer with her other arm, and held them both as if wrapping herself in their love would somehow protect them from the truths still left unspoken. "I didn't want you to grow up thinking love was something that could be taken away," she whispered into their hair. "So I tried to give you all of mine, every piece." Max leaned closer, his small hand patting her cheek, as if to soothe her. "We know, Mommy," he said softly. "We know you love us." But he looked like he wanted to cry when he saw us. That sentence pulled something sharp and painful in her chest. She remembered Leonard's face in that moment, shocked, frozen, then conflicted. She hadn't wanted to see it. She hadn't let herself believe there could be regret behind his eyes. But children had a way of seeing truth before adults let themselves believe in it. And her boys, innocent and bright and untainted by bitterness, had seen something she refused to acknowledge. Ilara didn't want to lie to them anymore, but she also didn't want to paint a man into their lives who hadn't earned a single stroke. So she took a breath and answered gently, "There's a lot you're too young to understand, but you're not wrong to feel what you felt. Sometimes hearts know things before words do." Milo looked up, blinking sleepily. "So, he is?" Ilara nodded once, slowly, her voice catching. "Yes, he is." The truth hung there, quiet but enormous. Max's eyes widened, then softened. He didn't ask why he had never been there. He didn't cry or accuse or demand answers. Instead, he said, "I just wanted to know." I think my heart already knew it. Ilara pulled them both into her arms again, this time not to shield them, but to soak in their strength. They were so young, yet already carried wisdom she couldn't teach. They had sensed truth through the smallest glance, the smallest silence, and now in this small room with nothing but a flickering lamp and a window that looked out into a dark sky, that truth had finally found light. And Ilara, who had spent years choosing silence as a shield, now realized it could no longer protect them from what their hearts had already uncovered. That night, across the city and far removed from the warmth of Ilara's tiny apartment, where her boys had just uncovered the truth through love and instinct, the grand Blackwell mansion sat shrouded in a cold, aching silence, interrupted only by the soft ticking of a gold-rimmed wall clock and the occasional rustle of leaves outside the arched windows. Leonard stood by the floor-length glass, his arms crossed tightly across his chest, but not from cold. He hadn't noticed the chill. He hadn't noticed the untouched drink on the table behind him, or the dimming lamp that flickered once before, settling into a low, steady glow. His mind was a battlefield tonight, no longer guarded by pride or denial, and the enemy was not the past. It was the clarity that had settled over him like a storm, finally crashing against a dam that had held too long. He couldn't sleep, not after what he saw, not after those eyes, the little boy's voice, the way his hand brushed Leonard's arm so naturally, the way the other twin curled into Ilara's side with a possessiveness only a child feels toward someone who carried them in their womb. Those weren't just feelings anymore. They were signals, flashing red through his mind, impossible to ignore now that they'd been felt, lived, faced. And every time Leonard closed his eyes, it wasn't the silence of night that met him. It was the image of Milo's tiny face, lifting toward him in confusion and innocence, and Max's fevered body curled in Ilara's arms, with features too familiar to belong to chance. Leonard, who had built empires and negotiated deals worth billions, now found himself pacing the marble floors of his study like a man lost inside his own home. He tried to fight it, the voice in his head that whispered, maybe, what if? Could it be? But that voice grew louder with every passing hour, and finally, surrendering to the weight of not knowing, he picked up his phone and made the call he never imagined he would. "Get me a private test. Discreet. I want the results in 48 hours. No questions." His voice had been flat, sharp, emotionless, but the moment he ended the call, his hand trembled slightly as he lowered the phone. Guilt wrapped its arms around him like smoke, thick, unshakable, bitter. He walked to the mahogany cabinet in the corner, opened the drawer, and pulled out something he hadn't touched in years. A small velvet box buried beneath business cards and keys. Inside, tucked carefully beneath an old letter, was a photo, faded but intact, of him and Ilara, smiling. It was taken on a spring afternoon at a lakeside picnic, back when laughter came easily, and the world still felt possible. She was laughing, her head tilted back, her eyes closed mid-laugh as he looked at her, completely captivated. He had forgotten that version of himself. forgotten the boy who once thought love was more than a transaction. And yet here he was, gripping that photo like a lifeline, like proof that he had once known joy before he traded it for walls, wealth, and silence. The memory of the night Ilara had cried in the mansion's courtyard played on a loop now. Unwelcome, vivid, brutal. Her eyes filled with tears, voice cracking, whispering, "Say something, Leonard. Say anything." And he had said nothing. He had stood there, arms at his sides, paralyzed by fear and pride and the looming presence of his mother's disapproval. He had thought silence would protect them both from a war they couldn't win. Instead, it broke them. And now, years later, as the wind rattled the windows slightly and the mansion echoed with loneliness, he realized that silence had cost him not only love, but something even more sacred: family. His fingers curled into fists, the photo crumpling slightly beneath his grip. 1,000 versions of what could have been played behind his eyes. First steps he had missed, birthdays he'd never attended, the sound of a first laugh, the warmth of 2 tiny voices calling him Dad that he had never earned. And yet they had looked at him. Milo had touched him like it was the most natural thing in the world. That innocence, that unspoken pull, it haunted him. He hadn't earned their trust. He hadn't earned even a sliver of their love. And still, they had seen something in him. Something he himself had buried beneath contracts, cold decisions, and cowardice. His mother's voice rang in his memory too, as if summoned by the ghosts of the present. Veronica's cruelty, her laughter, her venom dressed in silk. She had raised him to believe bloodlines mattered more than hearts, that loyalty belonged to legacy, not love. He had believed her once. But now he couldn't erase the ache that had bloomed inside him the moment Milo said his name. That ache hadn't stopped all night. And so, in the dark silence of his study, Leonard pulled open a drawer and retrieved a sealed envelope. Inside it, a snapshot, grainy but clear, taken quietly through the hospital's hallway cameras. Max and Milo. A security officer had slipped it to him out of courtesy when he'd asked who the boys with Ilara were. The officer hadn't known the implications. But Leonard had stared at that photo now a dozen times. The dimples, the eyes, the same furrowed brow he had as a child. The resemblance wasn't imagined. It was real. And suddenly denial felt not only impossible, but pathetic. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing again, his thoughts now flooded with 100 questions, none of which had comforting answers. What if the test confirmed it? What then? Could he walk into their lives after all this time and pretend to be something he never was? Would Ilara even let him near them? Did he deserve to be near them? Sleep became a stranger. He tried lying on the velvet couch in the study, but the ticking of the clock felt too loud. He tried turning off the lights, but the darkness only made the memories louder. He got up again, circled the room, sat at the piano he hadn't played since college, touched a few keys, then stopped. Nothing helped. The mansion, once a symbol of everything he'd earned, now felt like a prison built from regret. He couldn't look at anything without wondering what the twins would think of it. Would Max like the view from the library window? Would Milo ask to touch the piano? Would they run through these halls with laughter if they were his? The thought burned, because if the test came back positive, it wouldn't change the years lost. But it might still rewrite what came next. And if it came back negative, Leonard didn't even know which outcome he feared more. One would confirm his blood ran in them, and with it, the guilt of absence. The other would rob him of a connection he was already beginning to crave. Somewhere past 3 a.m., he sat again beneath the chandelier, the picture of the twins in his hand, his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. He didn't hear the rain begin outside, nor the faint hum of the heater switching on. All he could hear was Ilara's voice in his memory. Not the anger, not even the pain, but the strength she had carried when she turned away from him in the hospital and whispered, don't. That word had echoed ever since, not as a rejection, but as a mirror, reflecting everything he had refused to face. And now, as dawn crept slowly over the skyline and painted the edges of his study in soft light, Leonard Blackwell, the man the world feared and admired, sat hollow-eyed with a test pending and a heart full of questions. The answers were coming, and nothing would ever be the same again. The soft morning light poured in through the towering windows of Leonard's study, filtering through sheer curtains and illuminating the room in gold hues that failed to bring him warmth. He hadn't slept, hadn't even closed his eyes. His heart had been on a battlefield all night, fighting ghosts and guilt. And now, as the first rays of daylight painted the edges of the world, the battle came to an end, not with peace, but with truth. The doorbell echoed, faintly through the marble halls just past 8 in the morning, followed by the quiet shuffle of the butler's footsteps and the crinkling sound of an envelope being handed over. Leonard didn't move from the chair where he sat like stone, his elbows on his knees, his fingers gripping the photo of the twins that had haunted him every minute of the night. It wasn't until the butler softly announced, "Sir, the package you were expecting," that he rose, slow and deliberate, like a man about to open the gates of a past he could no longer deny. He took the envelope with both hands, felt the weight of it, not in grams, but in generations. A private laboratory, sealed, confidential. The answer to the question that had split his soul open. He didn't tear it open. He sliced it slowly, methodically, fingers trembling slightly as he pulled out the crisp white paper inside. His eyes scanned the document once, twice, and by the third time the words blurred because of the heat burning in his chest. Positive. Max and Milo Blackwell, his sons, his. Not just in resemblance, not just in fleeting moments of intuition or awkward glances in a hospital hallway. His blood, his legacy, his children. Leonard's knees nearly buckled beneath the weight of those words, and he reached for the desk for balance, breathing hard through the chaos that had suddenly become fact. He stared at the document again, this time tracing their names as if memorizing them would bring back the years lost. Maximum. Milo. Sons he had never cradled, never named, never watched take their first steps, but sons nonetheless. Every beat of his heart now pounded with the urgency to correct what he had allowed to go wrong. Without wasting a second, Leonard grabbed his coat and keys, shoved the results into a sleek black envelope, and stormed toward the part of the mansion that had always echoed with power and control, his mother's wing. Veronica Blackwell sat in her personal parlor, surrounded by elegance and old money charm, tall floral arrangements, classical music, a glass of sparkling water balanced beside her manicured fingers. She looked up as he entered, immediately registering the storm in his eyes. "Leonard?" she asked, brows raised with casual disapproval. He threw the envelope onto the marble coffee table between them, the slap of paper on glass jolting the silence. "Read it," he said simply, his voice dangerously calm. She narrowed her eyes, reached out, opened the flap, and as her eyes moved over the words, her composure cracked like old porcelain under pressure. She sat back, blinking once. "No," she breathed. "Number this. This is a mistake. A setup. She forged this." Her voice shot up several octaves, shaking with disbelief that quickly turned to fury. "You think that girl, after all these years, just happens to show up with 2 little money traps and expects us to believe this?" But Leonard wasn't listening to her tantrum. He was watching the exact moment her power began to slip. "She didn't ask for anything," he said, low and steady. "She didn't come to me. She didn't even tell me they existed. That woman raised 2 boys on her own with nothing, while you mocked her, shamed her, drove her away." Veronica stood up, tossing the paper onto the couch like it burned her fingers. No son of mine will be fooled into dragging garbage into this family, she snapped. But Leonard stepped forward, close enough now that their shadows collided. They're already part of this family, he said, his voice ice. You just didn't want to look at them because they didn't come with gold wrapping. But they're mine. I don't care what you say, Mother. The test proves it. My blood, my sons, and I will not be silent again. She stared at him like he'd grown horns, her face red with disbelief and something else, fear. The kind of fear a matriarch feels when she senses her grip slipping. But Leonard didn't wait for her response. He turned sharply, the echo of his steps declaring finality as he walked out, envelope now clenched again in his hands like a sword, no longer something to fear, but something to wield. Hours later, at the Blackwell Estates formal dining hall, a place rarely used except for family announcements and celebrations, Leonard called for a dinner, inviting every influential family member who had ever clinked glasses in the name of prestige. The long mahogany table gleamed beneath the chandeliers, the crystal glasses perfectly aligned, and the butlers in black and white ready to serve. Veronica sat near the head of the table, her lips thin, her nerves hidden beneath layers of diamonds and silk, pretending the morning had been nothing more than a dream. But Leonard didn't share her talent for denial anymore. As the dinner began, conversations hummed about business, stocks, new real estate acquisitions, but Leonard didn't engage. He waited, watched, until the main course had been cleared and the wine was mid-pour. Then he stood up, slowly. The room quieted. He didn't need to tap a glass for silence. His presence now carried the kind of weight that demanded attention. All eyes turned to him. Veronica looked up warily. Leonard cleared his throat, eyes scanning the table of relatives and partners, and then he placed the black envelope in the center of the table. "I have something to share," he said. The butler paused mid-step. Veronica's nails tapped the edge of her wineglass. Leonard's fingers pressed down on the envelope like a judge issuing verdict. "You all remember Elara," he began. A few murmurs rippled through the room. Some eyes widened, some lips pursed. Years ago, she was dismissed, cast out, silenced. But what none of you knew, and what I only just discovered, is that she didn't leave alone. Veronica's shoulders tensed visibly. Leonard flipped the envelope open, pulled out the DNA results, and let the silence swell for a moment. Then he looked up, gaze fierce, voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Max and Milo, they're mine. My sons." Gasps erupted. A wineglass shattered at the far end of the table. One of his uncles coughed awkwardly, but Leonard didn't flinch. "They're my blood, and whether you accept them or not, they carry the Blackwell name in their bones. That's not up for debate." The room spun with reactions, shock, confusion, a few silent nods of respect. But it was Veronica who stood, her face pale now, stripped of her control. "Leonard," she hissed through gritted teeth, "you are throwing everything away for the past." But he turned to her, calm, final. "No," he said, "I'm reclaiming what should have been my future. I'm rebuilding what you helped me destroy." And with that, he pushed the document to the center of the table and added, "Meet your grandsons." No more secrets, no more shame. The silence that followed was deafening, but it was no longer his silence. It was theirs, and it would echo long after the night was over. The dining hall stood frozen in stunned silence, long after Leonard's declaration had shattered the fragile illusions of prestige and pride that his mother had woven over decades. The untouched plates, the barely sipped wine, and the forced smiles of the family all seemed irrelevant now, because every eye in the room was no longer on the chandeliers or on the fortune they had come to celebrate. It was on the man standing at the head of the table, fists clenched, chest heaving slightly, and eyes burning with a fire no longer buried beneath obedience. Veronica didn't speak. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Her hand gripped the edge of the table, trembling not from age, but from disbelief that her control, her name, her very sense of importance, had been publicly undone by the son she once molded so perfectly. Leonard stared at her, not with hatred, but with something far heavier, disappointment. His voice, when he finally spoke again, was quieter, but each word landed like thunder in the stillness. "You ruined the only woman I ever loved." His voice cracked at the edges, not from weakness, but from pain, long buried, and now rising like floodwater through the cracks in a dam. "You took her dignity, her peace, her future, and you did it in the name of protection. You dressed your control as love. You called your cruelty family loyalty." He stepped around the table, slowly closing the distance between them, his eyes never leaving hers. "But it was manipulation, and I let you do it. I let your silence become mine. And because of that, my sons grew up without knowing the sound of my voice, the feel of my arms, the presence of a father who should have been there. All because I chose you over the truth." Veronica finally blinked, her voice breaking into a whisper. "I didn't mean to, Leonard. I only ever wanted the best for you." Her eyes shone with sudden tears, real but born of loss rather than guilt. But Leonard shook his head slowly. "No," he said, his tone calm but laced with steel. "You wanted the best version of me that you could control, not the man I needed to become. You didn't care who I loved, only that she didn't fit your design. You didn't care about my happiness, only about our image. But image is a lie, and I won't build my life on lies anymore." Veronica stumbled slightly as she sat back down, her legs failing her, the chair catching her like a throne that no longer belonged to her. Her fingers clutched the armrests, her carefully painted lips trembling as she whispered, "You're throwing away everything I built." Leonard looked at her, now from above, his jaw clenched. "Number, I'm saving everything I almost destroyed because of you." And with those words he turned and walked out of the dining hall, each step loud with purpose, not looking back at the relatives who now whispered and shifted uncomfortably, unsure of who held the power in the Blackwell legacy anymore. The next morning the sunlight rose over the city like an omen of reckoning. Leonard arrived at the Blackwell corporate tower sharply at 8, his suit crisp, his face composed but unreadable. The boardroom had never felt this cold before, not because of the air, but because of what was about to unfold. Veronica had spent the night in silence, locked in her room, refusing meals, replaying every word Leonard had said. But now she was here, seated in her usual position near the head of the long glass table, dressed impeccably, her hair set, her pearls shining like armor, but her eyes tired, darkened with sleeplessness. Around the table, executives and family shareholders took their seats, murmuring in confusion as they noticed the rare presence of both mother and son at a board meeting not previously scheduled. Leonard stood at the end of the room, straight and silent, waiting for every person to be seated. When he finally spoke, it was with the authority not of a son, but of a man who had found his voice. "Before we begin, I'd like to address the structure of this company's leadership," he began. A rustle moved through the room. Veronica's spine straightened. Leonard continued. "For too long, this empire has been shaped not by innovation, not by truth, but by fear and pride passed down through generations like heirlooms." His gaze moved to his mother. "Today that ends." He turned to the secretary, who passed out the printed motion, signed by Leonard and half the board, to restructure the company's leadership. Veronica's name had been quietly removed from all executive positions. The room gasped. Veronica stood suddenly, her voice rising in a panic-laced pitch. "You're removing me? After everything I've done for this company? For this family?" Leonard didn't flinch. "You did what you believed was right. But that doesn't mean it was right. And your decisions, made in secrecy, driven by judgment, have cost us more than you'll ever admit." Veronica's voice dropped low, almost pleading. Leonard, I built this from scratch. I stood by your father, But he raised a hand. You built it, yes, but not alone, and not without damage. Your legacy will remain in the books, Mother, but not in the boardroom. He turned back to the table. Effective immediately, Veronica Blackwell will no longer hold any active leadership role in this company. This family, he added, his eyes sweeping the room, will no longer be built on arrogance and silence, but on truth, compassion, and accountability. The vote passed unanimously. Veronica sat down slowly, her pearl necklace now feeling like a chain around her neck. Her empire, her illusion of eternal control, crumbled silently in that room, not with scandal, not with shouting, but with the quiet authority of a man who had found his redemption. Leonard didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He walked out of the boardroom with grace, his steps echoing as clearly as the truth now cemented behind him. The media would hear about it soon. The world would speculate. But none of that mattered to him. What mattered now was what came next, and as he stepped into the elevator and looked at his own reflection, he saw not the son of a powerful woman, but the father of two boys waiting to be claimed. Before the doors closed, he whispered to himself, "Your legacy ends with shame. Mine begins with love." And this time he believed it. The echo of Leonard's declaration in the boardroom still rang in his mind, like a war drum growing softer but no less impactful, as the car pulled into the quiet, working-class neighborhood Ilara now called home. The glossy towers and marble corridors of the Blackwell Empire were a distant memory here, replaced with cracked sidewalks, flickering porch lights, and the hum of evening life in its rawest, most honest form. As the sun dipped below the rooftops, casting soft amber light across the small building, Leonard stepped out of the car, the DNA results still folded neatly in his pocket, no longer for proof, but as a reminder of why he was standing there now, why his heart was pounding louder than any hostile boardroom confrontation. This was different. This was real. He climbed the narrow staircase slowly, one step at a time, until he stood in front of the old wooden door that bore no nameplate, no decoration, just the faint scent of something warm inside, like fresh lentils or cinnamon tea. He stared at the door for several seconds before finally gathering the courage to lift his hand and knock. Once, twice, then silence. From inside, he heard the muffled sound of a chair scraping against wood. Light footsteps. Then the doorknob turned with hesitant rhythm. When it opened, the first thing Leonard saw were her eyes, those same dark, molten eyes that once looked at him with boundless affection. But tonight, they held no welcome. They held walls built from years of silence, hurt, and survival. Ilara stood there in simple clothes, her hair braided back, her lips slightly parted in surprise that died as quickly as it came. She didn't speak immediately. She simply stared, and Leonard, for the first time in years, felt smaller than he ever had in front of anyone. She didn't need to shout. Her silence was louder than any slap. Then, finally, her voice came, not broken, not bitter, but cold as stone and sharp as glass. "You have no right." Leonard opened his mouth, but no words came. She stepped forward, just enough for the hallway light to reveal the glint of tears that had not yet fallen. Her eyes narrowed, her jaw clenched with fury, held too long. "You let them throw me away," she whispered. "You stood there and watched. Do you remember? I begged you with my eyes. I waited for your hand. You gave me silence." Her voice cracked then, just slightly, but her stance remained firm. "You never searched. You never asked. You walked away, Leonard." He tried to speak, but she shook her head, eyes glassy now. "Don't," she breathed. "Don't come here thinking your guilt is some holy redemption. You don't get to knock on my door and act like time forgives anything." Leonard's legs gave out, not from weakness but from the weight of regret, and before he even realized what he was doing, he was on his knees in front of her, looking up with desperation bleeding through every pore. "I didn't know," he whispered, voice trembling. "I swear to you, Ilara, I didn't know about them, about the twins. I thought you left. I thought you didn't want—" She laughed, bitter and soft, one hand covering her mouth as her body trembled with the effort to stay strong. "You thought I didn't want you. After everything I gave you, after the nights I held you through storms, after I looked at you like the sun rose only to shine on your face." She turned her back, unable to let him see the way her hands shook, and wiped a tear that finally escaped. Her voice was low but laced with fire. "Fixing a broken soul isn't easy, Leonard. You can't just stitch over years of abandonment with one apology." The hallway was still. Even the old floorboards beneath them seemed to hold their breath. Leonard rose slowly to his feet, unsure of where to stand, what to do with his hands, how to navigate a room no longer his, to enter freely. From the corner of her small living room, two small shadows emerged, twin faces peeking around the doorway, eyes wide, silent, searching. Max held Milo's hand, both dressed in pajamas, their hair still damp from evening baths, their faces uncertain but drawn by the quiet storm of emotions they couldn't fully understand. Ilara noticed their presence and instinctively moved, to block them with her body, but Leonard saw them, really saw them, for the first time not as a mystery, not as DNA, not as possibility, but as his sons. And they looked at him not with fear, not with hatred, but with the same silent curiosity they had carried in the hospital. Ilara turned, following his gaze, and her shoulders dropped slightly. She didn't want this confrontation to be their memory. She didn't want to be the mother who locked the door in their faces when their father came knocking, no matter how much her heart screamed against it. She walked toward the boys, knelt to their level, kissed their foreheads. "Go get your drawing books," she said softly. "You can sit in the living room." They nodded, uncertain but trusting. As they disappeared again, she turned to Leonard. Her voice was quiet now. "For them, you can come inside, but don't mistake the door for forgiveness." Leonard nodded, barely trusting his own voice, and stepped into the apartment. It was small, modest, but warm in a way his mansion had never been. Toys scattered neatly into a corner basket. A folded laundry basket sat near the couch. Family photos were few, but all of Ilara with the boys, smiling, laughing, holding hands on a park bench. His absence in those memories screamed louder than any accusation. She gestured to the armchair, and he sat. She didn't. Instead, she remained standing, arms crossed, eyes never leaving him. "Say what you came to say," she said. Leonard swallowed hard. "I want to be part of their lives, not just in name. I want to know them, raise them, protect them. And I know I don't deserve your trust. I know nothing I say tonight can fix what I didn't do years ago. But Ilara, please, don't punish them with my mistakes." Her lips quivered slightly, but she held firm. "I never kept them from you. You kept yourself from them. Remember that." He looked down, the shame burning through every layer of his expensive clothes. Then he whispered, "I still love you." Her eyes snapped to his, fire rising instantly. "Don't," she said, voice thick. "Don't throw that word around like it's a lifeline. Love shows up. Love fights. You didn't fight for me, Leonard." Her voice broke then, just slightly, and she turned away, her arms wrapped around herself like a shield. Leonard stood slowly. "Then let me fight now. Let me start today. You don't have to forgive me, but I will be here, for them, and for you, if you ever let me." Ilara didn't answer. Her silence was no longer rage. It was survival. The pain behind her eyes was not new. It was carved deep, layered like sediment beneath oceans of heartbreak. She had carried it alone. She had endured. And now, finally, he saw it all. Every crack, every wound, every lonely night, reflected in the woman before him who once gave him everything without asking for anything. And as Max and Milo returned, their crayons in hand, settling on the rug nearby, Ilara sat beside them, close, protective, quiet. Leonard remained standing, unsure of his place, but for the first time, willing to earn it. The air was still carrying the weight of unspoken apologies and tender silence when Leonard stepped out of Ilara's apartment that evening, but this time he didn't leave feeling dismissed. He left with purpose. He had seen her pain, felt her distance, and though her heart remained guarded, she had let him into the same room as her soul, and that was more than he had dared hope for. The boys had shown him their sketchbooks, stick-figured families with 3 smiling faces, always missing one. But tonight, for the first time, Leonard had watched Max draw 4 people, hesitating before scribbling in a man beside their mother. It had shaken him to his core. He realized then that if he wanted to be part of this story, he couldn't write his way in. He had to earn every line, every scene. So the next day, without fanfare, without chauffeurs or polished shoes, Leonard returned, not to talk about business or apologies, but simply to ask if they'd like to go somewhere. Just us, he had said, nothing fancy, just a night outside. Ilara had raised a brow, skeptical but curious. Where? She asked cautiously. You'll see, he smiled, kneeling to Max and Milo. You two like stars? Their eyes had lit up like the very constellations he spoke of, and Ilara, despite herself, agreed with a soft sigh, unsure whether this was a good idea, but deep down wanting to see what he could be when the walls of privilege were stripped away. They drove in his less flashy car, one he hadn't used in years, far away from the towering skyline and its echoes of judgment. The journey was quiet at first, until Milo began pointing out cows and clouds, and Max asked 1,000 questions about how stars are born. Leonard answered the ones he could, made up the ones he couldn't, and smiled more than he had in months. Ilara sat beside him, arms crossed, but gaze occasionally flicking to him, catching the boyish way he laughed when Milo made a joke that made no sense. She hated how familiar it all felt. She hated how a part of her wanted to laugh too. They stopped at a clearing miles from the city where the grass was wild and soft, and the sky opened like a cathedral above them. Leonard had already arranged a safe fire pit, a small bag of marshmallows, blankets, and a telescope that looked far too complicated for someone who once called stars sky glitter. The boys tumbled out of the car, racing toward the field, their voices ringing like bells in the open space. Ilara stepped out more slowly, the night wind brushing her hair across her face, her heart beating fast for reasons she didn't want to name. Leonard laid out the blanket near the fire, lit it with awkward hands that made Max giggle, and then sat back, patting the spot beside him. For a long while they didn't talk much. The boys roasted marshmallows on sticks, dropping a few, laughing more. Leonard tried to tell a ghost story but forgot the middle, and Milo scolded him. "That's not how spooky stories work, Dad. I mean, Mr. Leonard." The slip made Leonard smile so hard it hurt. Ilara froze at the word too, but she didn't correct him. She watched her sons melt into this moment, into a reality she never thought they'd have, and the ice around her heart chipped just a little more. "Want to try one?" Leonard asked her gently, handing her a perfectly toasted marshmallow. She took it, careful not to let their fingers brush, but her eyes held his for a second too long. "Not bad," she said, chewing. "Better than I expected from someone who thought mac and cheese came from Paris." He chuckled, brushing invisible lint from his jeans. "I'm learning," he said. "I'm not perfect, Ilara, but I'm here, and I'm not leaving." The fire crackled between them, filling the silence with warmth. Max ran over to show Elara a constellation he and Milo had discovered, and when she looked up to point it out, Leonard watched her face, the way the starlight softened her features, the way her lips parted in awe, the way her boys lit up just being near her. Then, as the fire dimmed slightly and the twins cuddled together under a blanket nearby, whispering about aliens and galaxies, Leonard turned to Elara, voice low, heart bare. I'm not asking you to forget, Elara. I know the past is scarred and complicated. I'm just asking if you'd try again. She didn't answer right away. She looked up at the stars, blinking away something behind her lashes. Try again, she repeated, her voice tired. Try again with what, Leonard? Hope? Love? Trust? He didn't rush her. He let the night speak, too. Crickets sang. Wind moved gently through the grass. And after a moment she exhaled deeply, shakily, like someone letting go of something that's been sitting too long in her chest. She didn't speak after that. Instead, she slowly leaned sideways, resting her head on his shoulder. Not tightly, not completely, but enough. Enough to make his breath hitch, enough to make her feel his warmth again, enough to tell him she hadn't slammed the door, just cracked it. Her eyes remained on the sky, but he turned his slightly to look at her, and in that moment, under that vast ancient sky, Leonard knew this was the first step back. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't love reborn, but it was something even rarer, possibility. The kind of quiet, golden possibility that only exists under stars, when money doesn't matter, when names don't echo, when history sleeps for a while and lets hearts breathe. They sat like that for what felt like hours, not speaking, not moving, just breathing the same night air, surrounded by the soft murmurs of children's laughter and the crackle of fire. And when the boys eventually fell asleep beside each other, arms tangled and marshmallow stuck to one cheek, Leonard rose and gently placed a blanket over them. Elara watched him with something unreadable in her eyes. She still didn't know what to call what she felt. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't rage either. Maybe it was grief letting go. Maybe it was remembering how it once felt to be loved before the pain. She stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder, both of them staring at the sleeping twins. They deserve everything, she said quietly. Leonard nodded. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to give it to them. She looked at him then, really looked, and though she said nothing else, her silence didn't feel like the end this time. It felt like the space between what had been and what could still become. As the fire dimmed and the stars remained, that night became a memory the boys would never forget, even if they didn't understand its weight yet. It was the night they saw their mother lean, the night they heard their father laugh, the night the four of them shared a sky, and for the first time Elara didn't feel like she was alone under it. The embers of the campfire still glowed faintly in the quiet field as Leonard carried the sleeping twins to the car, his jacket draped gently over their tiny shoulders, while Elara folded the blankets, her hands moving in silence, but her mind stirred with something tender, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Hope. That night had cracked open a door, long sealed, not with promises, but with presence. And though the stars had disappeared by morning, the warmth between them had not. In the days that followed, Leonard returned again and again, sometimes with books for the boys, sometimes with fresh groceries when he knew Elara wouldn't ask for help, and sometimes with nothing but his own imperfect self, willing to be present, to learn, to grow into the man he never allowed himself to become. He didn't try to erase the past. He simply showed up in the present. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Elara let herself lean a little more each day, until one morning she found herself laughing at a joke he made in the kitchen while Max poured cereal and Milo wore his socks on his hands. It wasn't a perfect life, not yet, but it was becoming something real, something stitched together with intention and patience, and it was in that gentle rhythm that Leonard knew what he had to do. He didn't want to wait another year, another month, another day. He had lost too much time already, so he planned it quietly, not with extravagance but with love. On a warm Saturday morning, he brought Elara and the boys to a small garden tucked away behind a community library. It wasn't the kind of place headlines were written about, but it bloomed with daisies and forget-me-nots, and in the center was a trellis covered in ivy and fairy lights that danced even under the sun. Leonard knelt beside the flower bed, pretending to tie his shoe, but Max whispered, "Mommy, look." Elara turned, and there he was, down on one knee, his eyes locked on hers, not with regret, but with wonder. In his hand was no flashy diamond, but a delicate silver band with a tiny engraving inside. "For every starless night you survived." Her hand flew to her lips, trembling, her breath caught between surprise and tears. The twins stood beside him now, each holding a daisy and grinning ear to ear. Leonard's voice was calm, but full of emotion that wrapped around every word. "Elara," he said, "I'm not asking you to forget the past. I'm asking you to build a new one with me, not because of what we lost, but because of the family we are now, because I want to wake up every morning with the sound of our sons laughing and the sight of you beside me, no longer alone." Elara's knees buckled slightly as the tears spilled, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming flood of everything she thought she'd never feel again: belonging, safety, love. "Yes," she whispered through the tears, nodding. "Yes." The boys screamed with joy, jumping in circles around them, chanting, "Mommy said yes! Mommy said yes!" The wedding came 2 weeks later, simple, small, and breathtakingly sincere. It was held in that very garden, now strung with hundreds of tiny fairy lights that glowed like soft fireflies as the sun dipped low. Elara wore a flowing white dress that caught the breeze like poetry, her long curls adorned with a crown of hand-woven daisies. There were no diamond necklaces or designer heels, only barefoot grace and the kind of beauty that made time stop. Leonard stood at the altar in a charcoal suit, not overly tailored, not overly grand, but perfect in how he looked at her, as if every dream he never dared to name had just stepped into the sunlight. The twins walked ahead of her, scattering petals, tripping over each other and giggling, while guests smiled through misty eyes. Veronica sat in the last row, alone, dressed in muted gray, her once commanding presence now humbled by time and consequence. She watched with hands clenched tightly in her lap, her throat tight with unspoken feelings. When Elara passed by, their eyes met briefly. Veronica blinked rapidly, her lips parting slightly, but no apology came, only tears. Elara gave the faintest nod, and that was enough. Forgiveness didn't need grand speeches. Sometimes just being present to witness the joy you once tried to steal was its own kind of penance. The vows were written by hand. Leonard spoke of the girl who once held him with quiet strength, of the woman who raised two brilliant boys with nothing but resilience and grace. He spoke of how he failed, how he waited too long to speak, but how every step forward now would be in the direction of her heart. Elara's voice trembled as she read hers, speaking of nights alone, of whispered lullabies to sons who didn't know what a father was, but also of the man who knelt in a field under stars and asked her to try again. "You didn't save me," she said, "but you saw me, and that's what saved us." When the officiant declared them husband and wife, Max and Milo raced into their arms, their laughter echoing through the garden louder than any applause. There was no ballroom reception, just a picnic of Elara's favorite foods, a playlist of songs from when they were young, and a small space between the trees where they danced barefoot on the grass. Leonard couldn't stop staring at her. Not because of the way the dress hugged her waist or the way her smile lit her face, but because she was glowing in a way he hadn't seen before. Not with hope, not even love, but peace. She laughed freely, dancing with her sons, twirling slowly beneath fairy lights that flickered like constellations. When Leonard finally took her hand, pulling her close, he whispered, "Thank you for letting me come home." She rested her head on his chest, her hand flat against his heart. "You're not home yet," she said softly, "but you're walking in the right direction." As night wrapped around them, stars returned to the sky, as if blessing the very place where their broken past had been buried and something beautiful had been born anew. Veronica stood quietly in the shadows, tears trailing silently down her cheeks as she watched Leonard pick up Max, then Milo, spinning them both as they screamed with joy. "Our dad is the best." She thought of the years lost, the pride that had cost her everything, and yet in this moment she found a sliver of redemption. Not for herself, but in knowing her son had broken the cycle she had once clung to so tightly. Ilara turned to look at her once, just once, and in that shared glance, two mothers bound by pain, a tiny thread of understanding passed between them. As the garden lights dimmed and the music softened into hums, Leonard and Ilara sat side by side on a wooden bench, the twins asleep against their laps. "It's not the fairy tale we imagined," Leonard murmured. Ilara smiled, brushing a curl from Milo's cheek. "It's better," she whispered, "because it's real." And as the moon rose high above them, casting a gentle glow across the quiet garden, a once broken family, now whole, held each other under the stars, not fearing the night any more. This was their beginning, their truth, their love, rebuilt, reclaimed, and radiant.